Welcome everybody back into Nerd Sesh. As always, I'm Carson Breber, and alongside me is Logan Camden, and I am extremely excited for today's show. This is something that we've been talking about doing all year, frankly, because Nikola Jokic has been playing at such a ridiculously high level this season that we've started to really talk about where does his peak rank in some of these all-time great conversations. So today we are going to figure that out, and we're not just going to figure that out. We're going to be ranking our top 10 peaks in NBA history. So to set a little bit of a framework for what that means, a peak to me is multiple seasons of your absolute highest level. It is not your prime, which might go on for more than a decade if you're a LeBron or a Kareem. It's not the entire duration at which you are playing at like a superstar or a star level. It is multiple seasons of you at your absolute best, not using one season because some guys do have crazy single outlier seasons. And that's how I'm viewing it, Logan. Is there anything that you want to add before we get into the list?
No, I think that sums it up pretty well. I mean, for most of these guys, I'm looking at, a 3 to 5 year span, wherever they were at their absolute apex. Closer to 3, though, for most of these guys, because, I mean, that's what your prime is. You know what I mean? It's a couple of years sustained after one another. And
prime or peak? I think they're different. I think prime is longer. I think prime is more just as long as you are playing at a very high level, you're within your prime. I think your peak is your absolute best within that prime.
I guess the only thing I'd add on top of this is because we are talking about historic basketball players, I think it's important that you judge them for the most part within the context of their era. Not saying that you shouldn't point out that guys have flaws in their game or stuff like that, but I think it should be mostly viewed within the scope of their own era.
Super glad that you added that, because that is a major thing to emphasize, because that's the only way that I think you can judge basketball players in these all-time conversations. You have to view them within the context of their time, what was most impactful in that time. You cannot expect anybody to be generations ahead of what was the norm at their time. And so that's how I view all of these players. How great were they relative to their peers? How impactful were they within the context of their era? We actually did an episode, a guest appearance on Mars Talk Sports show. Some of you guys may have seen him from the Player's Choice podcast, but we went on his podcast and we ranked the top 10 peaks since 2000 with him just last week. So if you want just the more modern group, you can go ahead and check that out. But as Logan said, we are going to be exploring all eras in today's podcast. The one caveat that I will say is pre-Russell, I don't give as much credence to. Pre-Russell Wilt era, if you're talking about Mike, and I just think the league was in such an infantile state at that point that that's the one exception I'll make to judging people relative to their era and to their peers. Before we get into this, Logan, do we want to give honorable mentions? I kind of think we save that for the end because I don't want any spoilers on who is left off your list. And there are some amazing honorable mentions here, like dudes who it's hard to believe aren't in the top 10, but there's just been such incredibly high peaks. Do you agree with that, saving honorable mentions for later?
I do. I think we should save them, yeah.
All right, so with that, Logan, who's in your 10th spot? Who had the 10th highest peak in NBA history?
Arguably the hardest guy, I think, to rank on this list, and I would hear an argument for him all the way up at number 1, and I have Bill Russell here in the 10th spot. And the reason I would say I would hear an argument for him is he just won. Bill Russell always won, no matter the scenario. And specifically when you're looking at his peak from 61 to 63, he's a 3-time MVP. He leads out the best defense on the planet every single season, and he wins a championship every single year. I also think it's staggering to look at how the Celtics performed on and off the court with Bill. When Bill was on the court, they won 75% of their games. He only misses 7 games over that span. They go 1-6 in those games, right? Bill completely transformed that team. And when you're looking at what he provided in that era, it was elite rim protection, elite defense at the most valuable position in the sport. And that's why I think you have to respect what Bill Russell did, because he is consistently leading out the best defense in basketball by a really wide margin. And it's not particularly close. And in this era, he was the best defender. I think he's the best defender ever when you're looking at the scope of what he did in his era. Ability-wise, I'd probably take Hakeem, but again, like relative to her era, I think that's important to emphasize. I think it's Bill. And his offensive game, I think, is a little overly criticized by people. Bill was a good connecting piece. He was an elite screen setter, right? He was a good passer within the flow of the offense, right? He's not making crazy reads, right, with the ball in his hands or anything out, but handoffs, stuff like that, spotting cutters. Bill was very capable at doing all of that. Over this peak, right, he's averaging 5 assists a night in the playoffs. Really valuable stuff, especially in Boston when you have that many good scorers surrounding him. And I think that's important to emphasize about these Boston teams that Bill was on. That was his role. Bill didn't need to score the basketball. When he stepped in here, his job was to protect the rim, to play smart ball, to be positionally sound, and again, to play a connecting role. You know, you've got Hondo for that. You've got Sam Jones. You've got a lot of other guys that were reliably getting buckets, and that wasn't Bill's job. The reason that he is at number 10 for me, Carson, I don't know if you view this differently or if you hold this against him. And again, it wasn't his role, but it is the limitations of his offensive game. I think when we're looking at everybody above him, Bill Russell is the most offensively limited player. And like I said, if you don't want to include that in your evaluation of Bill, I think I understand that. And if you would argue him higher because it just wasn't as important and that wasn't the role on his team, I understand that argument. But I think everybody else was at a higher level as a scorer. Some guys were more impactful as playmakers. Some are the greatest offensive engines of all time. And I think everybody else clearly has a higher two-way value than Bill. But like I said, I understand if you don't hold that against him because it wasn't Bill's job, and he was the greatest defender ever. And because of how successful he was for so long and how great he was at his peak, I think I'd hear an argument for Bill at 1. I wouldn't push back at that. I would hear any Bill for any place on this list. For me, though, the offensive limitations do put him at number 10.
So I agree that Bill is the toughest player to rank on this list. But what I will really emphasize with Bill Russell, and this is the same thing that I said when we ranked our top 25 players, full stop, right, over the entirety of their careers, which we did last summer. You can go ahead and check out that whole series. No modern standard can be applied to Bill Russell because the value that he had defensively was so much greater than anything that we've ever seen in the history of the sport. There is not any sort of legitimate debate to be had about who the greatest defensive player of all time is. There are people who will try to tell you it's Hakeem Olajuwon because of the stock numbers and because he's the greatest modern defender, and he was amazing. But the impact that one singular monstrous rim protector and deterrent and interior defender could have in the 1960s before the three-point line, when everybody's objective was to get to the rim and buckets were harder to come by in general, the impact that Bill Russell had, we've never seen anything remotely close to. The stat that I always love to bring up when people talk about Russell's offense, the Celtics were 3 times last in offensive rating when Bill Russell was on the team. They won the NBA title every single time. They were that much better than everybody else defensively. It is by that far the greatest defense we've seen in NBA history. And Russell was so singularly responsible for that defensive greatness. He joined a well below average defense, and he made them by far the number 1 defense in the NBA. In his final season, the Celtics were comfortably the number 1 defense in basketball. He left and they fell to a below average defense again. He was a perfect defensive player. I mean, we don't have the stock numbers, but estimates are that he was blocking 8 to 10 shots a game. And on top of that, he was incredibly agile and quick, and a guy who could defend on the perimeter, which wasn't as important back then, but he could do it. He had great hands in terms of generating steals. He was a really good post defender and just an unprecedented intimidator and up there for the greatest rebounder in the history of basketball. So that's what you have to consider. The Celtics are winning the title every year. The Celtics are winning the title because they are far and away the number 1 defense every single year. And they are far and away the number 1 defense because Bill Russell is far and away the greatest defensive player ever. And in 1961 to 1963, I would agree with you, that's his 3-year peak. You get a better offensive version of Russell than we've ever seen. And by the way, in 1962 and 1963, his absolute 2 best seasons, Boston's defensive rating was 6 points better than the next best defense in basketball. Those are margins that we haven't seen since the 1960 Celtics, and they did that year after year. And again, that is all Russell because look at what they looked like without him defensively. But in 62, this is when he takes a leap as a passer. This is when he becomes more assertive as a scorer. And he does that in a time period that coincides with Bob Cousy's decline offensively, where he's not quite the same player. But in the 61 to 63 playoffs, Bill Russell is giving you 21, 26, and 5 on 2% better than average true shooting percentage, In the regular season, he's not quite as productive. He's 18 a night on below league average true shooting percentage, and he is still clearly the weakest offensive player on this list. But you got a version of him that was a legitimately valuable, a legitimately good offensive player who could contribute as a scorer with solid efficiency, who was a very valuable fast break starter as a passer. And you mentioned his ability to facilitate handoffs and whatnot. And again, is clearly the most impactful player in the sport because what he's doing on defense is completely without any comparison. So this was his peak offensively. I would argue that this was his peak defensively, but his defensive impact was just consistently unmatched throughout his entire time in the league. And that's why I think if we're having a peak versus prime conversation, Russell's prime, his all-time ranking, is even higher than his peak to me because he had that unmatched defensive impact for all 13 years. He had it from the moment he stepped into the league to the moment he left the league. That's why they won 11 titles in 13 years. So in terms of absolute peak, yes, there is a clear peak for Russell, but the difference isn't as big as it is versus other players where Nikola Jokic comes into the league. He's a second-round pick, right? He's not even a guy who's really expected to be playing, and then he has this big ascent. Russell came into the league as one of the absolute most impactful basketball players, and he was that still when he left. So he's higher than this in terms of all-time ranking, but in terms of absolute peak, there are some dudes who I think have a slight edge because they were dominant offensive players. But again, I just think Russell's offensive concerns are so much less significant in his era because of what he was doing defensively. I have him as my number 7 peak because I just don't think you can really overstate how insane it was to have the key to winning a title every single year and have that coming all from one player who transformed one side of the ball like we've never seen from anybody defensively or offensively in history.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you bring up the peak versus prime thing because I think that applies to a lot of players on this list, is that that's what makes it more difficult in my opinion, because I do think Bill's greatness as a player all time, I think he's higher than this because like you said, he's not the last guy. From start to finish in his career, he had that defensive impact, and there are guys that just came into the league and transformed one side of the basketball or both immediately, and they did that for a long time. But I'm not factoring in longevity in here. This is
right
at the peak of their powers. And like I said, I mean, for what Bill did in his era, I would hear an argument for number 1. I thought for a minute, I was like, again, like I said, I think he is the hardest guy to rank on this list. And I thought, could he be there? With the, like you said, with the infancy that the league was in, with how young the league was and what was the most important thing that you could do in that era, Bill Russell did it. And so that's what makes it so tough. But I couldn't have a guy that's this limited offensively any higher. And that's where I fell down on that side of the fence. But yeah, I think Bill's the toughest guy to analyze, man. I think he is.
I'll be interested to see who you have above him, but I feel like we had this same conversation all time when I had Russell higher than you, right? It's a weird thing, but like you just have to look at the results. You have to look at how the Celtics won titles and the fact that they were able to do it in spite of being bad offenses. And again, they were singularly an all-time great defense, the greatest defense ever, because Bill Russell was by so far the greatest defensive player ever. It's not an impact on one side of the ball that we could have ever seen in another era, but we saw it with Russell in that era, and that's how I'm judging these players.
How do you factor in how great that Celtics team was top to bottom outside of like Russell and his individual impact?
See, here's where I think sometimes that gets overstated, right? I think more than anything, the profile of a lot of those other players is elevated by Russell more than vice versa, because some dudes just have to eat up the volume, right? I mean, I love Hondo. I have a ton of respect for Hondo, and he was an awesome defensive player.
I mean,
he was
there
a really
some
good
series
playmaker.
where those guys are really inefficient, though.
Their offenses were almost always inefficient. And I think that gets lost because people look at the raw numbers and they go, oh, Russell's only scoring 16 a game. Or in these peak years in the playoffs, he's scoring 20 a game, which is definitely better. But again, not overwhelming. It's the weakest number we're going to see from any of these guys we're talking about. But that's just because we tend to focus on offensive numbers and scoring volume in general. And you can't quantify Russell's defensive impact with the individual counting statistics of this era because they didn't exist. They didn't track steals and blocks. But look at the team impact. Look at why they won. And he was far and away the driving force of all of it. Shall I reveal my number 10, Logan?
Go for it.
In my number 10, I have in some ways the guy who's most comparable to Bill Russell in the modern era, I kind of feel like. I have Tim Duncan in my number 10 spot. Another guy who was impactful from the day he joined the league to the day he left, who was the anchor of a great dynasty that was sustained for a long time, a big man whose dominance, both individually and as the team, started on that defensive end. But I think that oftentimes people do look at Duncan as being really solely a longevity career case when we're talking about him in these all-time great conversations. And I think his peak gets underrated because I think the Duncan we saw from about 2001 to 2004, but specifically 2002, 2003 Duncan, those 2 years I consider his absolute peak, was a dominant basketball player. I think he was more agile than he gets credit for. I think he was a better offensive player, a better scorer than he gets credit for. And I think people don't give full credit to how outstanding what he did was with limited rosters. And we talk about this a lot, but he goes back-to-back MVPs over these 2 seasons. In the regular season, he's almost 25, 13, and 4 with almost 3 blocks a game on plus 5% relative true shooting. That's points above league average true shooting. And he gets even better in the playoffs. He goes 25.5, 15, and 5 assists, 3.6 blocks per game on plus 5% relative true shooting percentage, maintains that really impressive efficiency. And in the regular season, both these years, he leads top 3 defenses. That's what he did year after year. He also leads back-to-back top 9 offenses. And we have on-off numbers by this point, and he's improving the team by over 12 points per 100 possessions. And if you look from 01 to 03, the Spurs average 59 wins per season, and they win the title in 2003 when Duncan does not have anything close to an all-star teammate. His second best player in that 03 title run is very young Tony Parker, who in the playoffs is under 15 points per game on worse than 5% true shooting below league average in the playoffs. Manu Ginobili, 9 points per game on average true shooting. He was super young. David Robinson was super old. Still a good defender to have on the floor, but giving you 8 points per game, right? Wasn't a guy who could play heavy minutes. So I continue to think that run, it's appreciated adequately by some people, but it's without a doubt one of the 5 best playoff runs that we've seen in the history of this sport from an individual. And when you're talking about the all-time carry jobs, it's that and it's Hakeem in 1994. Those are the 2 runs you look at and you go, how did this roster win the title? And it's because they had their best player playing at an unbelievably dominant 2-way level. So this is why I prefer Duncan's peak to, say, a Kevin Garnett. I think that that's an interesting debate to have, but the distinction that I make is Duncan showed the ability to anchor you as an offensive number 1. I think because he had the ability to impose himself physically as a post hub, and I do think he was an underrated passer at this stage, he could just physically get himself those high percentage, high quality shots more consistently, whereas KG, skilled as he was going to live on more of a mid-range heavy shot diet, and he just didn't hold up as well as an offensive number 1. And people will say, oh, well, the supporting cast were so much better for Duncan. No, in this time frame, they really weren't. Like, were they better than KG's Timberwolves? Sure. But again, look at the dudes around him, right? The thing that I always love to mention, Derek Anderson is their second leading scorer in, I believe, 2001. And that's a team that's pushing for 60 wins. And it's because Duncan is anchoring them on both sides of the ball at an extremely high level. Now, compared to the other players on this list, outside of Russell, he's going to be the weakest offensive player. And the reason I have Russell above him is, I mean, they're both all-time great defenders. I think Duncan's a top 3 defender, but again, it's just a different level what Russell was doing and what was possible in that era. And I think that definitely outweighs the offensive edge that Duncan does have. But everybody around him is at a higher offensive peak, is a better offensive engine, a better offensive anchor. And that ultimately, in most cases, is what is going to be most valuable to me. But Duncan's 2-way case is so incredibly high. He gave you such an incredibly high floor as a team throughout his prime, and I don't think he gets full credit for that. I think he belongs here. There are some dudes who had flashier primes, but man, he was just an incredible 2-way force at his best.
I agree with a lot of what you said, and I have Tim Duncan at number 9. And the only reason that I have him above Bill Russell is because when I really struggled with who I was debating between, and again, maybe this isn't the most sound logic, but to give you a view into what I was thinking was, I'm starting a team, who would I rather have? I'd just rather have a guy with Duncan's offensive skill set. And again, that's probably not the best an easiest apples to apples comp, but that's why I went with Duncan. And the other thing that I really agree with is I do think he's underrated as an offensive player. You talk about how he's not flashy. Tim Duncan might be the least sexy basketball player ever. It's not sexy, but it's very effective. And I think you make an important distinction, too, with the Kevin Garnett. Kevin Garnett is working, primarily more out on the perimeter and more near the elbow, right? For Duncan, he's starting on the low block. And from there, he's going to generate a really good shot. Elite footwork, elite touch, great strength. If it was a hook, if it was a fadeaway, if it was a pull-up, he could get to it. And that's what his bread and butter was in the playoffs. And in this era, I think everybody thinks nowadays, right, when you're working from isolation, you're starting on the perimeter. No, Duncan's just going one-on-one with the opposing team's big man, and he's going to serve him a bucket because that's what you did back then. And again, he gave you one of the highest defensive floors ever. And like Bill Russell, you make a great point. I think when you factor in longevity and impact from start of his career to end of it, I think Duncan's way higher on this list. Because from the day he walked in to the day he left, he was a good defender and would make, even old-ass Tim Duncan was still effective, right?
Still the rim protector for a number one defense. Still a very effective rim protector. He couldn't move like he could when he was younger, obviously. But that's part of the reason I think his peak gets underrated. He was so good for so long that it's almost a curse because people who didn't watch that younger Duncan or just watched an older version of Duncan for so long after forget what an athlete and what an offensive post hub he was and how skilled he was, how he could attack off the catch and drive. And he had a really nice spin move. He had an awesome hook. Of course, he had his bank shot. He could use jabs to create space, like the body control, his entire post bag and offensive skill set. I think it's underrated because, again, he was still productive for so long after, but in a different role.
And I agree with that too. The biggest thing about his defense is, to me, Tim Duncan was producing some of the greatest the greatest defenses of all time in what is, a really tough defensive era, right? He's outproducing the Pistons of that era, and I feel like that's the team that everybody points to. Tim Duncan was, obviously the most responsible for producing that outcome, but he's outproducing them, not single-handedly, but
well, the 2004 Spurs.
Exactly.
They are a historically great defense, even more so than the Pistons, and that's the year after Robinson retires. That's Duncan's first year as the full-on solo anchor.
And and I don't want to he's got Bruce Bowen out there, right? And he's got Stack and some good personnel, but it's Duncan more than anything else, and they were consistently great during his time. And that's why Duncan's here to me, is the totality of his two-way impact. And he's going to make me a great defense. At his apex, is athletic, is agile, can do everything, and offensively brings you a lot. And again, in this era, when a lot of games are rock fights, this era was grimy, it was nasty, it was clogged up. You got two big men on the floor, and one of them is probably really unskilled. He's just big, right? Tim Duncan brought you stability that you needed. Again, it's not sexy, but it's really damn effective, and it translated to the playoffs year in, year out. And I think you made another great point, the thing about his supporting cast. I feel like for so long, when you think about Parker and Ginobili and the depth of those teams, and then, you get Kawhi Leonard, and people just kind of conflate that to say, oh, well, Duncan had a great supporting cast every single year, right? That wasn't the case. Early Duncan was making those teams great single-handedly. And he's got Robinson very early on. But again, even with Robinson, right, people will say, oh, well, he had the Twin Towers at the start. David Robinson isn't anywhere close to his apex when Duncan steps in. And
especially once we're looking at this 2002, 2003 range.
And that's what I think really gets buried with Duncan and shouldn't get confused.
Yeah, I do think that, again, here, he's kind of a victim of his own greatness, right? Because you look at some of his peers of this era, and people look at the Kobe years from 05 to 07, and they're like, oh, man, how can you blame him? He misses the playoffs, or he's winning in the mid-40s. Like, look at the supporting cast. KG has the years.
To Tim.
Exactly, where he misses the playoffs, or he's getting bounced first round year after year, and people say, oh, look at the supporting cast. Duncan, this period where he really had underwhelming supporting casts, just gets overlooked because he won a title. The fact that he had the underwhelming supporting cast, I should say, is what gets overlooked because he still made you a 58-60 win team and was going to have you in contending conversations. And in 2003, when he was at that truly superhuman level, willed you to win a title. So again, it's just other dudes who are still higher level offensive number ones, be that They were more overwhelmingly efficient. Obviously, there's a number of dudes who were more impactful playmakers, although Duncan was a good passing big. Dudes who just have more gravity because of a freakish trait. Like Duncan was going to rely on a little bit of that mid-post, self-created offense that wasn't super efficient. He didn't have crazy, overwhelming physical advantages, right? He wasn't collapsing the paint, obviously, like a Shaq or what have you. But still a guy who could lead you to be a top 10 offense and a top 3 defense every year. And that was incredibly valuable. All right, I'll give my number 9, since you had Duncan in that spot. I have Larry Bird here, and I'm calling his peak from 1984 to 1987, where he gives us a very neat 27, 10, and 7 on plus 4% relative true shooting in both the regular season and the playoffs. And the reason that I have Larry Bird here is I consider him one of those tier 1 offensive guys, right? I consider Jokic the greatest offensive player ever, and then the tier 1 to me is him, Magic, Steph, Bron, Jordan, and Larry Bird. And Larry may not have the unfathomable efficiency of a Jokic or a Magic, and he may not have like their monstrous assist numbers, but he's probably my favorite plug-and-play all-time great offensive player ever, because he's got probably the best feel in basketball history, and he's on the short list for the most versatile offensive players ever. He was an elite jump shooter, and he weaponized that in a bunch of different ways. Posting up, off movement, curling around screens, out of isolation, lethal jump shooter. He was incredibly crafty, right? The use of fakes and the footwork and the touch, the difficult shot making, outstanding. And he was an incredibly smart mover away from the ball. So as a scorer, he could kill you in all these different ways. He was a good offensive rebounder. He had great touch on tip-ins. And then on top of that, he's probably a top 5 passer of all time. He's at least a fringe top 5 passer of all time. That's not going to show up with 10 assist a game seasons, but again, that's because of how he fit in offensively. And so much of it was quick touch ball movement. He's the best touch passer of all time. He was an amazing transition passer, and he could do it in so many different ways as a passer. He could run pick and roll for you. He could spot cutters out of the post. He could do everything. And he was so deceptive. He was so creative. He saw everything as it was happening quicker than the defense could. So that's where I think he has this extreme offensive value. It's constant, multifaceted, versatile impact offensively, and he's leading out some of the best offenses we've seen. And at the same time, the Celtics are consistently elite defensively, and that's where Larry separates himself from a Magic Johnson in terms of a peak, from a Steph Curry in terms of a peak. He was a clear plus defender, and in this period, he's averaging basically 2 steals and a block, and he's an elite rebounder. Super disruptive in passing lanes, excellent hands, big body, right? Had the size, brought some secondary rim protection because of that. And again, was a really impactful rebounder and a very smart defensive player. So that's why I prefer him to a Magic. Again, I think he's an easier fit offensively, and he's a significantly more impactful defender. And versus Duncan, I mean, this was close to me because of the defensive impact from Duncan. But if I'm getting a Larry Bird level of impact offensively, right? Again, to me, one of the 6 greatest offensive players ever. And at the same time, he's a great fit offensively. I love his portability, his scalability alongside different types of personnel, right? I mean, you saw it throughout his career, right? In that era, he could excel at the 3. He could excel at the 4. That wasn't as common as it is today. Positions weren't interchangeable like that back in the day. That's what I love about Larry. And the dominance you cannot undersell as well, because look at that production, look at that efficiency, and look at the team results. He wins 2 titles in 3 years from 84 to 86, and he's MVP every year.
Not only that, I mean, I specifically look from 84 to 86. They win 62, 63, and 67 games. Like, automatic 60-piece every year. Can I ask you one question, though? So I don't want to steal your thunder on this one. Does that mean that you don't have Magic Johnson on your list?
Does mean that. It does.
That's interesting to me. So I have Larry at my number 7 spot, and I do prefer him to Magic. Magic just happens to be in my number 8 spot.
Okay.
You know, I agree with you on a lot of the points you made. The defense, the scoring. I think the passing is underrated by some. He's just so versatile. There wasn't a hole in Larry's game. Like, he could just do everything. And that's why I also want Larry is I feel like he can get lost. Like Larry again, man, he doesn't have like he's not super athletic, right? It may not be the most sexy game, but it's really effective, and he could do everything on the floor.
If I could add one more point in Larry's favor,
Sure.
just because you mentioned the
yeah.
winning thing, which I think is such an important aspect of this, right? I mean, Larry won 74% of his career games. And we're talking about his absolute peak, at which point it was established that the Celtics were a dominant team. But even before he was at his absolute peak, his rookie season, Larry took a 29-win team without significant personnel changes around him and made them a 61-win team. Like, that's the sort of all-around impact we're talking about before he was at his best. And again, we're talking peak here. We're not talking prime, but the prime from Larry, I mean, the 9 years before he wrecks his back, he's top 4 in MVP voting every single year. He's top 2 in MVP voting 7 of those years. And this was just the absolute best he ever was. But this is why he's so highly regarded. I mean, for a decade, he was automatically making you an elite basketball team.
I'm glad that you brought that point up about his rookie year, because that was one of the tougher things that I had to do when gauging some of these guys, is weighing how much talent and how great their teams were, right? Because when we're talking about Larry's not only great, these are great all-time teams. These are some of the greatest teams ever assembled, right? And
Yes.
It's not just the starting five, right, where you've got, Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale, and you've got Dennis Johnson, right, down the lineups, right? You've got Danny Ainge, and you've got Bill Walton, and super reliable and effective guys there. So these teams are great top to bottom, and I found that, it's hard to gauge these guys individually when they're on great teams like that. But I'm glad you bring up the rookie year point, because that is, almost solely Larry. And I'm just surprised. I'm surprised that you don't have Magic here. I have Magic in the number 8 spot, and I consider him a part of the tier 1 offensive engines as well, considering what he did. Was he the toughest cut for you?
He was the toughest cut for me. And he is in a group with, I guess I'll just say it right now, Steph Curry. I mean, those two were easily the two toughest cuts for me. I love KG. I considered him, but I think that both Magic and Steph are clearly tougher cuts to me, and I wish I could have them in my top 10. It just comes down to, although Magic is a tier 1 offensive player, absolutely, and specifically, if you're looking at 1987, we're talking multiple year peaks, but that's one of the greatest offensive seasons ever, and he was almost a number 1 offense automatically, right? I mean, yes, he had great personnel alongside him, but that's just the reality. I want to say it's 8 and 9 years or something like that for the Showtime Lakers that they were number 1 offenses. It's them and the Nash run in the 2000s across Dallas and Phoenix, just like unparalleled number 1 offense year after year after year. And in 1987, I mean, he is scoring 24 a night in the regular season on elite efficiency, and by raw offensive rating, led the best regular season offense ever that year at the time, and the best playoff offense ever. And those are both records that would stand for like 30 years for the regular season, and the playoff one, I think, was just broken by the Nuggets in 2023. So that's incredible to have records stand that long. It just comes down to, when I'm comparing him to these other great players, Magic is a cut below defensively. And I think even compared to another offensive GOAT who is limited defensively, like a Nikola Jokic, I prefer Jokic's impact because he's so much better as a rebounder. He's much more active defensively, and Magic wasn't like a glaringly bad defender. I actually prefer him defensively to a Steph, just because Steph at his peak as an overall player was slighter, right? If you're looking at like 2016 compared to where he gets in like 2022, where he's a little stronger, you could really attack Steph more than you could attack a Magic. But then also I prefer Jokic's offensive peak to a Magic. So that's kind of the thing. I prefer his impact on both sides to both Magic and Steph, honestly. But I just ended up thinking what we saw from Duncan as a floor raiser when the talent around him was not good, it's incredible. And it was on both sides of the ball. And Magic never had to deal with adversity like that, but also I don't think that he was necessarily capable of single-handedly saving an entire team like that. What he does in the later years when Kareem has regressed is incredibly impressive offensively, but that two-way stuff from Duncan was special. And then Larry, again, it comes down to, I think he fits in more situations, and he's a significantly more impactful defender. That's the one thing with Magic beyond the defense is he was such a ball dominant player. He was very much going to dictate the style of play, and he wouldn't scale alongside other great players like all the other offensive GOATs who I just mentioned. If that's Steph, if that's Jokic, if that's Bird, Magic is going to struggle more in that regard than all those guys. It was super close. I couldn't keep Duncan off this list, though, with what he was doing in 2002, 2003.
I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but I did put Magic on the list. And part of the reason why I went with Magic was just I was looking at, I guess I'll say it. I mean, Jokic was my toughest cut. I have Jokic at number 11. And
wow.
The most significant reason, and this is probably the biggest issue, I thought that Jokic is probably a better or a more portable scorer, like I think in any era, just because Jokic is so dominant and so strong and his footwork, like you can just dump it to him on the low block. You make an interesting point with the rebounding. The reason I went with Magic over Jokic was because I looked at them positionally, what they brought defensively, and I just thought Jokic and his vertical, rim protection, I looked at as more of a positional liability defensively than Magic, because with Magic, he may not be, he probably gets overrated a little bit as a defender, but he is versatile. He can play different positions and guard different groups, and he's not.
Well, kind of.
You
didn't want Magic guarding a quick guard, that's for sure. You kind of hide him on a not-so-good offensive four.
I looked at him as less of a liability, I guess, in terms of a team offense than Jokic, and that's why I ultimately went with
defense.
Magic. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I can see the positional value point, right? Because center is the most important position. And look, Magic's size defensively was still valuable on the glass because he's one of the best rebounding guards we've seen. He obviously wasn't built like a guard. He was 6'9". I just think Jokic does a lot more to positively impact the defensive end. And even if he does have a clear limitation at a very important position, I think what you get with his defensive IQ, I honestly think that he cares more about that side of the ball than Magic ever did. And you don't see that every single night maybe with Jokic defensively.
But Jokic can't. He's at the most important spot defensively, so he doesn't really have an option, He doesn't have an option, but he's doing it. And I do think that he ends up being a solid defensive player because outside of his glaring athletic limitations, which are a big problem when it comes to rim protection, he does a lot of good stuff for you defensively, where I feel like Magic is just very meh through and through. And then I do think that Jokic is the better offensive player. I think that the scoring is more unstoppable. I think the single most unstoppable action in the history of this sport is a Jokic post-up. And I think of that combination of being the best scorer alive and the best passer alive and being as versatile and as efficient as he is, it's led to one of the most impactful players we've ever seen in the play-by-play era where we have this on-off data, like basically the most impactful player in terms of how his team performs with him on compared to off it. And I do think he's more versatile offensively, right? He is the epitome of a guy who can play so many different ways, right? With what he does as a screener, with what he does curling off screens, with what he does off the roll, with what he does out of the post. And both these guys are very selfless, but Jokic just doesn't dominate the ball in the way that Magic did. And I do prefer that when we're talking about, obviously, literal GOAT offensive players. I think that that's something that fits more easily alongside other really good players. That's a good argument. This was the toughest decision that I had to make.
One more thing real quick about Magic, and we've already said this about both Russell and Duncan. He's another guy whose prime is greater than his absolute peak because his prime was like Larry and basically from the moment that he entered the league, right? And all the way from 1980 to 1991, his entire time in the league before HIV, 12 seasons, Magic is a bona fide superstar. And he and Larry are in very, very rare company in NBA history. And every single year, because they're that great, their teams are winning 60 games, basically. And Magic makes 9 finals in those 12 years. So that's why I would have Magic higher in my all-time rankings than I do in my absolute peak rankings.
Yeah, and like Larry, I mean, they just had unalienable things that, just would never change. It was the feel. It was the brilliance playmaking. I think he's the greatest passer of all time. And, if it's outlet passing in transition, man, if it's up the floor getting creative, like It's beautiful. It's beautiful stuff. And Jokic is an all-time passer too. This was the toughest decision, figuring out if Jokic made my list. Ultimately, the deal breaker was Magic's one more on a bigger scale. And if Jokic comes away, and that's what's tough too, is it's like the league is way more talented, I think, now than it was. And Jokic is the best player on the planet and has been for the past 3 years. Jokic and Bill Russell, I felt like, were the toughest guys to rank on this list. And positional value defensively is ultimately what is the reason why I left Jokic. Jokic, Steph, and one more guy that I'm not going to bring up because I don't know if he's on your list or not, were the toughest omissions for me. Jokic and Steph were among the 2 of the 3 toughest cuts.
There's one thing that I will take issue with in the spiel that you just gave right now, and it's the winning aspect. Because, like, I don't know if you could find a much greater difference in supporting talent when we're talking about all-time great players.
That's a great point.
Like, I love Magic Johnson, Logan. I love Magic Johnson. I think he gets underrated as a scorer. I think that his efficiency is a testament to that, right? He was a walking mismatch, one of the greatest transition players, the greatest transition player ever. I would say him and LeBron are the top 2, but a post problem, a pick and roll problem. I think that aspect of his game gets underrated because the volume isn't crazy. And again, I mean, in the later years, right, Hakeem isn't a superstar force anymore, and the Lakers are still a number 1 offense, an elite offense every single year. But I don't know if you're finding a more talented decade of team rosters than the 1980s Lakers. Like, it is absolutely ridiculous. They had, for the longest time, the best duo in basketball history, I would probably say, right? I mean, I love Scottie and Jordan, but the level that both Magic and Kareem were at in the early 80s, where they are both bona fide MVP caliber, I think Kobe and Shaq probably peaked higher. Maybe that's really close. But again, the difference is you get more years of Magic and Kareem together than you do with Kobe at a superstar level and Shaq. So that's the point I would make there. And again, if we're looking at careers, well, it's still not close because Magic has been at this superstar level for 7 more years than Jokic has been at this MVP level, and still a handful more years than Jokic has been at a real star level. And of course, the career winning does make a difference. But if we're just going peak to peak, I mean, in Jokic's peak, he's got a title, and he has led his team to have, when he's on the floor, a point differential that would be the best in basketball. And he's done that missing 2 of his best supporting castmates for an entire season. And he's done that with a roster that, when he's off the floor, has produced a point differential that would be the worst in basketball, right? So I don't think that the titles comparison works when we're going peak to peak, because I think Jokic's impact on winning right now is unbelievable. And he's achieved elite success, team success, when he's on the floor with talent that isn't remotely comparable to what Magic had alongside him with Wilkes and Kareem in the early years. And then you have Worthy and Byron Scott. You have Norm Nixon in those early years. Like, those teams were truly amazing.
Yeah, maybe it's illogical to think like that. Let me ask you this. Of the players on your list, do you think that Jokic won with the least talented supporting cast?
Of the dudes who made my list, well, are we talking about the title? I think that the most impressive title run in terms of supporting talent is 1994 Hakeem, followed by Duncan. But I think that Jokic is right in that group there with them. And again, just the impact numbers that we've seen in recent years, there's no comparison. I mentioned that stat about when he's on the floor. This is all the way back to 2022. This is 4 years. They are the best team in the league. That's what their point differential is equivalent to. And when he's off the floor, it's equivalent to the worst team in the league. He's on pace to be the first player ever with a plus 20 on off differential in 3 straight seasons. And the swing from like a Luka, it's like 5 points over this time span. Giannis is like 7. Embiid is like 9, right? All the dudes who get compared to him in terms of regular season success, he is more than doubling that swing. And that holds up. People like to talk about the starting lineup playing together. There's an entire season where Jamal Murray doesn't play, right? I mean, Jamal probably hasn't played in half of those games, and we see it year over year. The numbers hold up. You take any of those one players off the floor, as long as Jokic is on the floor, you are an amazing basketball team. And this year, we've seen maybe the craziest difference ever, where the Nuggets have a 130 offensive rating with him on the floor, which would be by far the best ever, and a 97 offensive rating with him off the floor, which would be by far the worst offense in basketball. Like, he's doing completely unprecedented stuff on that end. And we now have, over the last 5 years, Logan, Jokic averaging 26, 12, and 9 on plus 9% relative true shooting. And he's gotten better in the playoffs, where he gives you 30, 13, and 8 on plus 5% relative true shooting. We've never seen that combination of raw production and efficiency, while it's also leading to unprecedented impact. When we look at the difference between when he's on the floor and off the floor, and when you just watch the games, this is a dysfunctional offense. Without Jokic on the floor, there are no advantage creators. And that's been the case for years. That's not what a Jamal Murray does, right? He doesn't beat you off the bounce consistently. He doesn't play make at a high level. Everything is centered around Jokic creating a great shot with every touch. Jokic making perfect decisions. Jokic getting into the teeth of the defense, being the best scorer alive, and then demanding an overwhelming amount of defensive attention, and being the best passer alive to work off of that. I do think he's a significantly better scorer than Magic, as much as I love Magic's scoring. And I'll say Magic is the best passer of all time. I'll agree with you there. I think Jokic is the second best passer of all time. You could argue Nash. I think that's clearly the top three right there. So that's just an unprecedented duality to have, and he's also the best rebounder in basketball. So that's the thing, the impact at that size on the glass, it's insane. He's the best passer, scorer, and rebounder in basketball. We've never seen that in the history of this sport, and he's putting up unprecedented impact numbers, unprecedented efficiency numbers, unprecedented box score numbers, and he's taken it up another level this year. So I have Jokic at number 8, actually. This is a nice little segue. I have him in my next spot, and the reason that I do have him down at number 8 is he's the weakest defender on my list. I think he is a more impactful defender than Steph or Magic, as I talked about. I think he's better than them on both ends, because versus Magic, I think he does have the edge as a scorer, and he does have the edge in terms of off-ball value and screening and offensive rebound, all these different things that he can do, better shooter of the basketball. And versus Steph, he has the ability to directly impose himself on the game and get you a great shot at will in a way that prime Steph Curry doesn't, where he could be overwhelmed by really physical defenders, and he just couldn't get to that range like Jokic can, where he gets inside of 10 feet, 12 feet, and as we've talked about time and again, he's literally 65 to 70% on hook shots and floaters and touch shots. There's just no way to guard that when that dude is also the best passer on the planet. So I prefer him on both ends. And I just think when you're literally the best offensive player ever and you're the best scorer and passer and rebounder, you belong this high on the list. I think everybody else has the edge because of defense, but I couldn't keep Jokic out of my top 10. I mean, I've never seen a player impact the game offensively like this, and what he has done for these Nuggets teams for 5 years, one of the greatest carry jobs, really, and that's not to diminish the supporting cast, but it has been a carry job. It has been an incredible, unprecedented offensive carry job.
It has been. And maybe looking back, if we revisit this topic or something, maybe I'll look back and appreciate that more. But you said what I said, and that's why I would leave him off this list. I think he's the least effective defender of anybody on my list, or would be, and that's why he's number 11. So at number 10, I've got Bill. Ooh. At number 9, I've got Duncan. At number 8, I've got Magic. And at number 7, I've got Larry.
Real quick, before we move on, I just want to quickly revisit the point about impact and supporting cast, because I read off the stat about the Nuggets being the best team with Jokic on the floor and the worst team with him off it over an extended stretch. Now, we don't have the plus-minus numbers with Magic Johnson, right? We don't have it going back to then, but what we do have is nevertheless record with a dude on the floor compared to off it. For the Nuggets, since 2021, they win 67% of their games with Nikola Jokic. That's unbelievable. That's an elite pace. They win 37% without him. The Lakers won 74% of their games with Magic Johnson. It's incredible, obviously one of the best numbers ever. But without him, over his career, because he didn't miss a ton of games, so we're using a bit of a larger sample size, they won 58% of their games without him. Still a really good basketball team. So that's the thing. Between these two all-time great offensive engines, I think we have to acknowledge the difference in help is monumental, and the difference in terms of just organizational brilliance, because I'm not even someone who rags on the Nuggets organization. It's just the Lakers, again, were as talented as any team we've ever seen. I think it's important we emphasize that difference. The Nuggets really do fall apart without Jokic, and the Lakers were still a very good team without Magic. Obviously not close to the same, but still good. So, you read off your list so far. I have Duncan 10, Bird 9, I have Jokic, and I'm considering his peak all the way from 21 to 25, even though I do think he's gotten even better within that time frame. And then I have Russell at number 7. Getting some holiday shopping done this weekend? Pick up some touchdowns. They're on sale at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. What else would you expect from the number one place to bet touchdowns?
DraftKings has doorbuster profit boots and bet one, get one promotions on all types of touchdown bets. Be sure to check the DraftKings Sportsbook app all weekend for flash deals that will have you dancing in the end zone.
Grab some TDs with DraftKings Sportsbook. They're on sale from Thanksgiving through Cyber Monday. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code NERDS to opt in. That's code NERDS only on DraftKings. The crown is yours.
Do you want to revisit any of those guys? Or you want to get into
No,
the
I think
top
we've
six?
covered it. Let's go to the top 6. Who you have in your 6th spot?
In my 6th spot, I have Shaquille O'Neal, and the reason that Shaq is up this high is because of his two-way value, right? When you look at guys like Bird and Magic, all-time offensive engines, and Bird and Magic bring their own respective defensive value. Bird, I think, brings more, but they play right on the wing and on the perimeter, right? Shaq can have a different kind of level of two-way impact because he plays center, and at his apex was a pretty damn good rim protector. Like rookie Shaq coming into the league when Shaq was committed and had bounce and wanted to be good on that end, he was. And at his prime was a really good rim deterrent. But the biggest reason why he's up this high is because he's one of the greatest offensive players of all time, one of the most unstoppable ever. I think more so than Bird or Magic at their absolute apex, right? Those guys could make offenses great, but Shaq was just unstoppable, and that's why he's above a guy like Tim Duncan. I think I prefer Duncan's defense and what he brings there, but Shaq is just on a different planet offensively. I'm looking specifically from 2000 to 2002 is what I consider Shaq's peak. They won the finals every year. He was the finals MVP every year, and he was a one-time MVP, but I think the best player in the league. And just what he does in those finals to the supposed best team in the other conference. The 2000 finals, he gives you 38 points, 17 rebounds, and 2 assists on 61% from the field. In 01, he gives you 33 points, 16 rebounds, and 5 assists on 57% from the field. And in 2002, he gives you 36, 12, and 4 on 60% from the field. You just had no answer. In the playoffs over that time period, 30, 15, and 3. He's just unstoppable. There was no answer for Shaq. And, you know, I think for his career, I think you can hold Shaq's longevity against him, right? The fact that Shaq wasn't great, you know, effectively by 2006, Shaq's done, right? His peak is over, right? I'll even give him 2005 where he was pretty effective with, it's not his peak, but you could still maybe consider it his prime, right? He was effective that
MVP
first year.
runner-up.
Exactly. But 06, that's really where you see the fall off, and he just wasn't the same. And so his, you know, prime is shorter than other guys, and I think that's why you could make an argument for him being lower, but it's one of the greatest peaks ever. For everybody above him, though, I like one guy's two-way value more than Shaq's, and that's why he's above him. And I think you could probably make that argument for 2 guys, for 3 guys maybe above him, and I prefer their offensive games, I guess, a little bit more maybe.
Okay.
But it's one of the highest offensive peaks ever. And Shaq was all 6 of these guys, including Russell too, I would hear an argument. I think I would hear an argument for number 1 because of their impact in totality. If somebody wanted to argue to me that Shaq had the greatest peak ever, I would hear an argument. I think Shaq was that good. But I prefer other guys' games to Shaq, and that's why he's down at number 6.
I feel pretty strongly about my top 2, but I will say everything in that 3 through 8 range, really, maybe even you could extend it. I don't know, 9 and 10 I think are also incredibly high peaks. Like, I had a lot of internal debates. I actually have Shaq all the way up at number 3, though. And I think when we did our all-time rankings, I probably had Shaq too low because I think the peak is that monumentally high. I also think the longevity, I mean, you mentioned, right, he's fallen off by 05, 06, but he came into the league in 92. So, I mean, he was a superstar player that entire time. That's good longevity. The fall off was precipitous.
Yeah.
Exactly. He's one of those dudes who, from the moment he came into the league, had that superstar impact. He didn't keep it until the moment he left, but he also ended up playing a really long time. I do think, though, as great as Shaq was in those Orlando years, you definitely see a difference between 2000 to 2002 Shaq and every other version, because I think after this, you start to see some of the negative effects of weight gain. You also just see a lack of focus defensively. I mean, that to me is the real thing, where you look at especially 2000 and 2001 Shaq and the level he was at defensively throughout 2000 and the level he was at defensively in the 2001 playoffs. That's where you just get this complete unstoppable force. And I think that also, I mean, just the raw power that he did have, right? This was clearly the best combination of insane strength, being the most massive human being in the league, but also still really being able to move, which he lost as he did continue to gain weight. But the production is almost unfathomable. I mean, 2000 to 2002 in the playoffs, he's 30, 14.5, and 3 on plus 5% relative true shooting. In the finals over those years, 36, 15, and 3.5 with 3 blocks per game on nearly 60% from the field. It's the greatest 3-year finals run that we've seen in the history of this sport. And the on-off impact is monstrous. The Lakers over these years were about 12 points per 100 possessions better with him on the floor. He was, first and foremost, a completely unstoppable offensive force. And I think outside of Jokic, the greatest offensive big man at his peak that we've seen. I'll take Kareem's career offensively over Shaq's, but the impact goes beyond the fact that it's like you look at those raw scoring numbers that he's putting up in the postseason and like, okay, those are heights that very, very few players have touched, and he's doing it really efficiently. But it's also just the fact that every single Shaq post touch, like you're sinking in hard, or you're probably just doubling out right because there's no prayer that you're stopping him in single coverage. And what that does for an offense as a whole, it's a level of defensive attention that we've never seen a player demand on the interior. He is far and away the greatest rim force.
I think even more than Jokic in how he collapses defenses.
Yeah, when you're talking specifically about drawing extra attention at the rim, I do. I think Jokic is just so much more better from the perimeter and is so much better as a passer that he surpasses him as an all-around offensive player. And the clutch is the difference there because Jokic can be your takeover clutch shot maker, and Shaq didn't have that level of offensive skill. But in terms of just being an unstoppable interior force, specifically at the rim, Shaq is one of one all time. He's number one all time. And that has such a massive impact on a team offense. And Shaq was a really good passer who could consistently make good decisions out of that. And that's why you see, I mean, in these years, the Lakers are elite offensively, consistently. And at the same time, he was a really high-level defensive anchor. You have some mobility issues with him, but they weren't as significant at this time. And there were better defensive bigs, right? This is actually an era where defensive bigs were running the league. You have Dikembe, you have Zoe in 2000, you have Duncan, right? You still have Robinson. We have to mention Logan Theo Ratliff. This was an era of shot blockers, and it was a slow, grinded out defensive physical era. But Shaq was really, really impactful on that end, and he was in some of those all-defense conversations. That's what you get from him in this period that you don't really get as much throughout his career. So I think it's the second highest offensive peak from any big ever, but then I think it's a significantly higher defensive peak from Jokic. That offsets the difference between the two of them, and it's just very fitting that people call him the most unstoppable offensive player ever, or the most unstoppable player ever, people call him. Like, it's pretty appropriate, right? We were discussing him with Mars, and Mars made the great point that the way that everybody determined that they would stop Shaq was with Hack a Shaq, right? But if you consider how brutal half-court offense was in that era, if you're putting a 50-something% free throw shooter on the line and you're getting 1 to 1.1 points per possession compared to like 0.85 points per possession, Mars said was the half-court average at this time, that's good offense. And that's the best answer that you have to Shaq, is a full-on gimmick. So, like, he's not an elite defensive big. So that'll hold him back from being in my top 2. I still do prefer players who have some level of perimeter skill because I think there are certain situations in which that's really important. And as I mentioned, the clutch is a prime example of that, being able to initiate and create from the perimeter, or having what Jokic has with his just like undeniable touch shot making. Shaq had good touch, right? He had good touch on his hook, but it's not at that level, and he can't do it from as far out as Jokic can. But like, those are really the only nitpicks that I have with Shaq. I think the two-way impact at his peak was absolutely monstrous, and there's a reason that he ran through the playoff field in a 3-year period in a way that really nobody else has, and the only two dudes who you can argue are the two dudes who I have above him.
It's a good case. I think Shaq was really hard for me to rank as well, and I actually have 3 big men above Shaq. I would just rather have them at the apex of their powers.
Okay. Well, why? Well, let's get into whoever's next here. Who's in your 5 spot? Is it another big?
In my 5 spot is Hakeem Olajuwon. And
okay.
Maybe
very close for me.
It was very close, right? Because I think that Shaq has a lot of an edge offensively with how dominant he was, but I also think Hakeem has a lot of an edge defensively. And maybe this is personal bias. Maybe, one, I'm holding the fact that Hakeem beat Shaq head-to-head in the finals. They swept Orlando in 95. I think it's important to contextualize that and say that, Shaq wasn't at apex Shaq at this point. He was not at the peak of his powers yet. This is still very much baby Shaq. And even though the Rockets sweep this finals, even though Hakeem leads every single game in scoring, I think, Shaq held his own. It's not a great or dominant performance like we see from Shaq at his peak, but Shaq played okay. He was just going up against a much better in his prime, at his peak, veteran in Hakeem Olajuwon, who dominated him. But I bring up my personal bias, and the only reason I say that could be potentially affecting me is because I think Hakeem might be my favorite player to watch ever. It is poetry in motion. It is art on a canvas. It is beautiful. It is so aesthetically pleasing to me. It's awesome. He has the best footwork ever. He has every fake in the world on the low block. Hakeem, I think, can maybe sometimes get put into this little box where, we think that these big men are really rigid and they're not fluid athletes. He was so quick. He was so agile. He was so decisive. I don't know if there's ever been anyone better at creating space on the block. And another misconception I think that people may have about basketball players in this time or previous to Hakeem is that they couldn't shoot. I think Hakeem had impeccable touch. He's automatic 15 feet and in. If it's fadeaway, if it's turnaround baseline J's, if it's hooks, Hakeem could make tough shots with guys in his face, and he could do it against the league's best defenders. You look at guys he's matched up with in this time, he's given the business to Dikembe. Shaq was a good rim protector at this time. Even though he may not have that veteran nuance and feel and positioning, Shaq was an athlete, and he could give Shaq the business. And he could do it through double teams, too, right? You see Hakeem dominating some of these games in the third quarter and the fourth, and they are sending doubles at him, and he is just rising and firing. Or he's dissecting the defense. I think another misconception is that Hakeem wasn't a playmaker. It's not Jokic-level stuff, but he could pass out of double teams. He was a good outlet passer. I think Hakeem was the total package. I love Hakeem's game, and he's one of my favorite players. I think he's the second best defender ever. I think at his apex was the best player in the league at this time. He had unprecedented two-way impact, and Hakeem is a guy that, despite maybe him not having perimeter spacing out to 3, could dominate in any era. I think you could drop Hakeem anytime, any era, and I think he would dominate. I love his game, Carson. Hakeem's one of my favorite players ever, man. And I wish we had the numbers where we could compare to like Wilt or Bill. Because, he's given you 1.5 steals per game and 3.7 blocks per game in the playoffs over this stretch.
Insane.
And like you've already brought up on this show, the 94 roster is not super dominant.
That's one way to put it, yeah.
Yeah, it's not great. It's not great stuff that you're getting from the supporting cast. And Hakeem willed that team to the title. In the 95, that's an interesting case study because mid-season they make the Clyde Drexler trade. And that is where I think Clyde Drexler deserves an immense amount of credit for what he did in that playoff run, the playmaking, the scoring. Hakeem is the engine, right? But Hakeem had a relatively inefficient run compared to what he did in 94.
Yeah, while scoring 33 a night.
Still, I mean, he's the best player in the league, and he's still
Yeah.
dominating. Don't get me wrong. It's a little less efficient, and he led every game in scoring in the finals. I think Clyde deserves credit. I also think Mario Elie deserves credit for what he did in that run, too. Those guys really pulled their weight, but I just prefer Hakeem's two-way value to Shaq, and maybe it's the aesthetics. I just prefer him, man. I don't know. I feel like I could go to Hakeem in a late-game possession and let him create his own shot on the low block, and I'd be a little more confident. Oh, the final stat. This one blew my mind. There's a lot of guys in the 1990s that didn't ever get an NBA Finals because of Hakeem and Michael Jordan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Charles Barkley, Reggie Miller, Gary Payton, Sean Kemp, Karl Malone, John Stockton. It's some of the greatest players of all time, and it's some of the greatest teams of all time that don't end up getting rings in this era. Patrick Ewing is another one of those guys, and he ran into Hakeem in 1994. In the 94 finals, Hakeem held Patrick Ewing to 36% from the field and 39% true shooting. I think this is Patrick Ewing a couple of years past his absolute peak, but this is still very good Patrick Ewing. And Hakeem dominated him on the biggest stage, completely wrecked him in that finals. So I think he's the second greatest defender ever. I don't think he has the offensive limitations that a Bill Russell has, and that's why he's above Bill to me.
Yep.
And again, maybe I'm unfairly holding that against him. And then with Shaq, I think there is a gap defensively, and that's why I prefer Hakeem, man. I love Hakeem. And to be honest, I considered Hakeem as my greatest big man ever. I ultimately went with two guys above him, but I did think about it, and that's why Hakeem's number 5 for me.
I love Hakeem even more than you do, buddy, because I have Hakeem at number 4. And I did
That fires me up.
Consider him above Shaq, dude. I have Hakeem from 1993 to 1995. It's not just the 2 title years. I think actually 93 is when he takes 2 simultaneous leaps. I think he takes a leap as a scorer. He goes from 21.6 points per game on 55% true shooting to 27 points per game on 58% true shooting. I think this is when he peaked as a post scorer. And he also takes a leap as a passer. He goes from 2.2 assists to 3.5 assists per game and was a very good passing big at his apex. I think, like Shaq, both those guys can get underrated in that respect. And he became a much more legitimate actual offensive number 1, because that was kind of the limitation for much of his prime, not his peak, but his prime, which starts damn near from when he enters the league, because he was such an impactful player. But it was that he wasn't a real offensive number 1 on a title caliber offense, because early in his career, he wasn't as good a passer. And I mean, you compliment, obviously he's the most beautiful post scorer to ever watch. Shout out Kevin McHale, but I don't really know if it's all that debatable. Honestly, I think Jokic is in that conversation. But the footwork, the creativity, the diversity of shot making, and just the pure skill as a shot maker, the balance, it's all absolutely incredible.
It would just make you feel helpless, I feel like, on the low block, man.
It's insane.
And you can throw 2 guys at him, and you can contest the hell out of the shot. It doesn't matter.
I'm sure somebody has said this before, and that might even be the reason I'm saying it. But in a lot of ways, he's like the Kobe of bigs, right? Where these are dudes who are unbelievable to watch. They're the greatest difficult shot makers ever for their respective groups. And they live on these tough shot diets, which actually in a playoff environment means that basically no matter what you're throwing at defensively, they can get to the same shots they're used to, and they can ramp up their volume, and they can do it against really good defenses, and they can still basically maintain the same efficiency. But also, the efficiency maybe isn't as great as a baseline. And in the regular season, and Hakeem early in his career, I think before he took this leap, wasn't a dude who was going to elevate a team offense as much because of his playmaking limitations and because he wasn't a super efficient scorer, right? I mean, it's not close to a Shaq where it's like, okay, cool, I'm just going to get to the rim every single time. Hakeem is living off of a diet of a lot of these tougher mid-range shots, working out of the mid-post fadeaways and turnarounds and whatnot. But once you get to 1993, the Rockets go from the number 20 offense the year before to the number 6 offense. This is the stretch, 93 to 95, when he was that true offensive number 1 who could carry you to a title. And obviously that's what he did. And on top of this, he's a top 2 defender of all time. Again, I don't think it's debatable that he's number 1 because of the impact that Russell has within his era. But I do think Hakeem is the greatest modern defender ever and has the best hands of any big man ever and was a massive disruptor because of that. And he's 255 pounds. He could battle physically in the post with the powerful bigs. He was a really good post defender, but just like the greatest modern stock machine that we have seen. And that's because he's this monstrous rim protector, but it's also because of his hands and his agility and his ability to cover ground and recover quickly and just erase space with that length and that athleticism. And that's what he did. I mean, he just was the second best defensive player that we've ever seen. But when he pairs that with this peak offense, that's where I think you're looking at a top 5 peak of all time, because it's arguably the greatest back-to-back playoff runs that we've ever seen. You have Shaq in 2000 and 2001. You have Jordan, honestly, all the way 91 to 93. And then you have Hakeem in 94 and 95. Over those 2 postseasons, he's 31, 11, and 4.5 with 5 stocks per game on plus 3% true shooting. And as we've talked about, 94 wins it all with one of the weakest supporting casts ever on a title team, if not the weakest. And then 95, yes, he has Clyde, but he also overcomes maybe the toughest path ever to win a title. He has to beat that year the 60-win Jazz, the 59-win Suns, the 62-win Spurs, and the 57-win Magic. We're talking about a Malone and Stockton-led team. We're talking about a Barkley and Kevin Johnson-led team. We're talking about a peak David Robinson-led team. And then we're talking about a Shaq and Penny-led team. It's unbelievable. His team was unquestionably less talented than all of those teams. And what does he do? He beats them all. He leads the playoffs in points per game both of these years with good efficiency, not great efficiency, but good efficiency as the best defender on the planet. And he was a really good passer at this stage in his career. And the regular season impact is also insane. You don't have a big sample size of the Rockets playing without Hakeem in the 94 and 95 seasons alone, but they went 4-8 without him, and they were 101 and 51 with him. And all the way from 85 through 97, his all-star seasons, they won 61% of their games with him and 41% without him. But again, I think even that number sells short the impact he had at his absolute peak, which is 93 to 95. And I do think there's a big difference between that version of Hakeem and the previous versions, as great as he was, because he got to a level where he was without a doubt the best scorer and the best defender in the game, and he got better in the playoffs. And all of those things, I don't think anybody else in NBA history has been able to claim simultaneously. So I absolutely love Hakeem. I mean, to me, the offensive gap between him and Shaq is a little greater than the defensive gap. I think that it's sizable going both ways, but I do think that, I mean, Shaq, again, the efficiency he was able to generate offensively for himself and his team, it's something we've never seen from a big. So I'll take Shaq because of that. And if it comes down to a tiebreaker, I tend to choose offense over defense, but I can't argue with Hakeem because of everything I just laid out.
I think that's sound. I prefer Hakeem's defense and just the fact that he is the second greatest defender ever. I really value that highly, and that's why I gave him the edge. So
you gave him the what?
I gave him the edge, man.
Oh, dear God. It's a family program, Logan. You want me to get to my number 6?
I don't want to assume things, but...
Don't. You'll make an ass out of you and me.
I'm going to guess that we flipped on the big men here.
I think we did. And I think that they're super close. So I think it's really interesting. I would actually argue, I said all the way 3 through 8. I think you could argue, but really 3 through 6 is where I think we are talking about incredibly small margins. In my number 6 spot, I have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And I think he's inarguably, all time, a top 3 player. But that's because his longevity is only surpassed by LeBron James. He's the guy with the longest prime outside of LeBron. And I personally have his peak at 1971 and 1972. I considered going with 76 to 78 for Kareem, because then I think that he was a better offensive player. I think he had truly mastered the skyhook, and I think he was a little bit better as a passer, and he was more efficient in the playoffs. So there's definitely a case to be made for that older version of Kareem in his first Lakers years. But to me, the defensive gap that goes in favor of early Bucks Kareem in 71 and 72 offsets that. I think that people can underrate how dominant a force he was defensively at this time in his career. He anchored back-to-back number one defenses in these years and back-to-back top two offenses, a number one offense in one of those seasons, and was just such a physical outlier at this point and was so athletic as well. I mean, his agility at his size, when he was consistently engaged defensively, as he was early in his career, and that was not something that remained the case throughout his prime even, he was probably the most impactful defensive player on the planet. I think you would have to say him and Wilt at this time, but an otherworldly rebounder, an otherworldly rim protector, shot blocker, not necessarily the smartest defensive player, but again, the physical tools were so crazy. He's still anchoring these number one defenses. And then offensively, the most skilled big at this time. I mean, regular season, these 2 years, Logan, he averaged 33, 16, and 4 on plus 10% true shooting. That is like unfathomable production and efficiency. And he just had such an incredible blend of size, again, towering over everybody in the league, but also being crazy agile for that size and being athletic, really athletic in these younger years, and also having this great touch and also being a good passer. He was such an offensive freak. The only reason that I don't have him higher is because it didn't scale as well to the playoffs at the time where he was at his defensive peak. In the postseason, over these couple years, he's 28, 18, and 4 on even true shooting percentage. Really, really big drop-off in efficiency. And so his offense didn't translate as seamlessly to the postseason as Shaq's, nor do I think he had that sort of insane, one-of-a-kind gravity that Shaq did because of what he was as a rim pressurer. It didn't even translate quite as well as Hakeem's, who was also the greater defensive player. So Hakeem, I think, outperformed him on both ends in the postseason. Kareem, these two regular seasons, I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And if you look at how great the Bucks were in 1971 and 1972, the 71 team has one of the highest point differentials ever. And the 72 team then goes right back and wins 63 games again. So it's just that little bit of postseason drop-off and just some overwhelmingly dominant factors from an Hakeem and from a Shaq that put them above Kareem to me.
Yeah, and I think you made the right call going with that version of Kareem too, because I think Kareem's best version of himself, if you could take his best peak defense and his best peak offense, I think could be higher, because what he's doing from 77 to 79, he's given you 31, 15, and 4 in the playoffs on 63% true shooting with 1.3 steals per game and 3.8 blocks per game. But I think he was more of a two-way force when you consider what he was doing earlier in his career defensively with Milwaukee. And he's still a really good defender. He just doesn't have, the same athletic traits. And I also think you see it reflected in win total. Granted, he misses a little bit more time, I think. It's not a lot. It's like 20 games over these few seasons, but he does miss a little bit of time. But those teams weren't as great as the early Bucks teams were, and I don't think those teams were exceptionally talented, which is why I think it's an interesting debate if you want, offensively oriented or defensively oriented Kareem. But I'd rather have Kareem, and that's where I sided with why I went with him over Shaq. Why I went with him over Hakeem. I just think I'd rather have him. I think I'd rather have Kareem as my center. That was, I guess, my justification.
Well, why? I'm going to ask why. Because that's a little vague.
I think he's got more skill than a Shaq, right? And I just value that a little bit more. And he is really impactful defensively. I don't know. Maybe it's a legacy thing. Maybe it's the name value. I'd rather have Kareem. That's what I ended up going with. That was the tiebreaker to me.
Okay. I think that the offensive gap to me is bigger than the defensive gap when you look at postseason performance. I mean, if we're comparing him to Shaq literally having as dominant a 3-year run as we've ever seen, and Kareem not quite playing up to his regular season. –
What do you think about the supporting cast on those early Bucks teams?
I think that the supporting cast, when we're talking about the 71 and 72 Bucks, it's pretty good. I mean, I think we can't really undersell how good Oscar still was. Now, it's interesting because I feel like sometimes some people can kind of overrate 71, 72 Oscar. Like, he was not the same force that he was at the peak, especially once you get to like 72. Then he has a rough scoring postseason. But if we're talking 71, I mean, this was still a dude who had been an automatic number one offense throughout the 60s and was still the best playmaker in the league at the time. And Bobby Dandridge was a really, really good two-way player, a star-level two-way wing. And then after that, I mean, the depth was fine, but there weren't a lot of rosters that were incredibly deep at this time. So I think they're very good rosters. I mean, I absolutely think that Kareem is the reason that these teams are great. And I think you can look at before they bring in Oscar, you can look at what he did with the Bucks in their second year of existence, right? I mean, they were an expansion franchise when they got him. So they won 27 games. Then they add Kareem, they win 56 games. So I absolutely think this was one of the most impactful two-way peaks we've seen in the history of the sport. And if we're just going regular season to regular season, I'll take him over Shaq and Hakeem. I will. The difference is I think those guys had historically great postseasons. And they didn't just do it for 1 year, right? They didn't just do it for 15 games. They did it for multiple consecutive seasons. And Kareem obviously wins the 71 title, but he's not even as dominant in that run as he was in the regular season. And then he struggles in 72. And he actually struggles in 73 in the postseason offensively. So I don't have a problem with you having him because I think it's really close between these guys. But I think Shaq was more overwhelmingly dominant offensively. I think Hakeem was more overwhelmingly dominant as a two-way player. But again, what sets Kareem apart is he was bar none the best player in the league for a decade. And that's why in all-time conversations, I don't think that there's really much of an argument that you could have Hakeem or Shaq over those guys unless you are like a literal peak purist. And also, I mean, you mentioned the supporting cast. Kareem doesn't really miss games in these years when he does have this very good supporting cast. But then once you get to 75, when famously Kareem misses the playoffs actually in back-to-back years, he does it first with the Bucks and then with the Lakers. But that 75 season, the Bucks were 35-30 with him, and then they went 3-14 without him. So I do think that's a testament to how incredibly impactful he was. So I guess I'll get into my number 5. Because we have this little hodgepodge of bigs here. I've got Wilt Chamberlain at number 5. And I've got Wilt in 67 and 68. If you want a 3-year peak, you can throw 66 in there. But we saw a distinct change in 67. And so that's the reason that I am choosing these 2 years specifically, because he was great in 66 and he won MVP that year. But 67 is really when we see an incredible version of Wilt Chamberlain. And if we were just going with single seasons, I think there's a real argument to be made. 1967 Wilt had a better season than anybody else in NBA history. This is a completely different player than Warriors Wilt, who was this super high volume scorer. I mean, especially in the first few years of his career, and a black hole in many ways, didn't pass the ball. And so he wasn't nearly as impactful on team offense as his volume numbers would suggest. Lakers Wilt, completely different player, right? That's an older Wilt, especially when you're looking at 72, his last couple years, just really wasn't scoring with much volume at all. This is a Wilt who maxed out his ability, and his ability was basically as great as any player we've seen in NBA history. 67, he averaged 24, 24, and 8 on 68% shooting from the field. He led the league in true shooting percentage, plus 14 relative true shooting percentage that season, while he was anchoring an elite defense and the number one offense in basketball in a 68-win team. I actually think Wilt is the player on this list with the most distinct, but also the most brief absolute peak, right? Because we can talk about Hakeem from 93 to 95 was a different player. Shaq from 2002 was a different player. And that's true in all those cases. But this was like the most dramatic difference of a dude who had all the ability in the world, just fully getting it. And fully getting it while he still had that peak ability for a couple years. That's the version of Wilt you're getting with the Sixers in 67, 68. He became extremely efficient, scaled down his volume as a scorer, but scaled up his volume as a playmaker, became an excellent playmaking hub who they were running so much offense through, and he was amplifying everybody around him, right? Spotting cutters and running handoffs and weaponizing the attention he drew. And also, this was when he locked in most defensively, and I would say became the second best defender on the planet behind just Russell. Shout out to Nate Thurmond. He is in these conversations too, but I mean, Wilt was just an unparalleled freak. Like we talk about with Kareem at his best athletically in 71 and 72. Neither of these guys were the smartest defenders. Neither of them were the most consistent defenders throughout their career. They both had some motor issues, some focus issues, but when you got them fully locked in for their best couple of seasons, I mean, they were two of the greatest defensive anchors that we've seen, just because physically, I mean, the combination of agility and just the height and the length, the shot blocking ability from Wilt, there was nobody like that in the league at this time. So 67 is just this glorious season where he maxes out his ability in all these different ways. And then 68 still leads a 62-win team and led the number one defense, the only defense in Bill Russell's entire career to supplant his Celtics as the number one group in the league. That matters. I think that is an incredible achievement on the defensive end from Wilt. He didn't match the previous year's efficiency this season, but he was still 6% above league average true shooting percentage. The only real knock on Wilt at this time is his free throw shooting was so horrible. I think he was 38% from the line across these two postseasons. That made it so his playoff efficiency really wasn't all that good. I mean, it was good. He was 3% above league average, but real major step down from the regular season. And I guess you could argue he didn't really have to take over as a number one scorer in the way a lot of these other guys did, but I don't hold that part against him because he was the best offensive engine in basketball, right? He was just doing it with more playmaking than scoring, and he had some really good players on this team. He has Hal Greer, he has Chet Walker, he has Billy Cunningham. Let those guys cook, make them better through selflessness. That's all I ever would have wanted from Wilt throughout the early years of his career. So I'm incredibly high on this version of Wilt. I guess the reason I have him at 5 would be I do think 68 is a bit of a step down from 67. It's a great season, but we are judging multiple year peaks. And also, I mean, just what Hakeem and Shaq did was so remarkable. And I think Hakeem was an even better defensive player and was the best scorer on the planet. And I do think Shaq was an even greater offensive player. Although that's close. All these guys are very close, but I have Wilt at 5.
I've got Wilt at number 3. And I just think he was head and shoulders as the best player in the league. And I highlighted 66 from 68. He was the MVP every single year. As you mentioned, 67, they're number one in offensive rating. They win the NBA championship. In that playoff run, individually, Wilt has given you 22 points, 29 boards, and 9 assists on 58% from the field. It's by far the most efficient Wilt ever was in his playoff career where he fully put it together. And again, I just want to emphasize what he was at this era. This guy's 7'1", 270 plus pounds with a 7'8" wingspan. He's basically unstoppable in transition. He's a monster off fadeaways. He had a butter finger roll. And I think he's an underrated passing big man. I mean, it's, again, some of the stuff you see today with DHOs, but he was spotting cutters, a really good transition outlet. And he's a monstrous shot blocker as the primary defender on the weak side. A couple of things that I think get taken for granted with Wilt at this time. This is a guy who ran his body into the ground, and a lot of players did that. Wilt is playing routinely near 48 minutes a night, playing in every single game. You know, it's pretty commonplace and it's a different game. Right, it's just naturally faster. I think it's more physically taxing playing in today's NBA. But over this span, he missed one game. It's routine for guys nowadays. You know, you miss 10 games a year, you miss 28 games. He's not coming off of the floor. And he's playing in every single game. I think that can sometimes get taken for granted. And Bill Russell, It says that Wilt was the smartest player he ever played against. On offense, on defense, Bill always talks about how brilliant Wilt was. And
No, on defense, that's a little generous. Wilt liked to chase his stats. He liked to chase his blocks, even though they were unofficial. He liked to chase his highlights. But he locked in for a couple years.
I think at this apex, I just don't think there were any holes in his game, and he had a really high two-way impact, and I think he showed it. That's why Wilt's number 3 for me.
I can't take much issue with it. One more thing that I will point out, though, these Sixers were so good, and Wilt was obviously their best player on both sides of the ball, but the year after Wilt left, 1969, the Sixers won 55 games. I mean, they had Archie Clark that year, but it's a lot of the same guys, right? It's Billy Cunningham, it's Hal Greer, it's Chet Walker.
Clark, bro.
Respect Archie Clark. Listen, I'm not discounting Archie Clark, okay? I like me a little Archie Clark, but this was a really good team, and I think sometimes that gets underrated because people do the whole, Russell played with all these Hall of Famers and Wilt played with who? And it's like, well, the reason you guys know who all of Russell's teammates are is largely because he won them 11 titles, whereas Wilt bounced around some more, and just not a lot of people really have that deep of knowledge of 60s basketball players. So I do feel strongly that over the scope of their careers, Russell's the better player because I think every single year, every second he was on the floor, he squeezed every possible percentage of winning value he had as a basketball player out of himself. Whereas I think Wilt left a lot of meat on the bone at some points in his career. But when we're talking absolute peak, Russell couldn't have done what Wilt did in 67 and 68. He just didn't have that level of offensive ability. And when Wilt was that committed to the defensive end and playing at this level offensively, I don't think you can really argue that Russell peaked higher. I think he's higher all time, but that Wilt peak was something else. So Logan, let's just go back through those 4 bigs who we had all jumbled up. I had Kareem 6 from 71 to 72. I had Wilt 5 in 67 and 68. I had Hakeem 4, and I had Shaq 3.
All right, so at number 6, I had Shaq. At number 5, I had Hakeem. At number 4, I had Kareem. And number 3, I had Wilt.
All right, so now let's get into the great debate. I think it was pretty clear that we were going to have these two as our top 2. Who do you have in the 2 spot, first of all?
I have LeBron.
Okay. So now the second question, I was just going to ask which version of LeBron.
Specifically, I have LeBron from 2016 to 2018. And I know we dipped our toes into this on Mars's show. And it is interesting, right? Because there's 3 different versions of LeBron to choose from. Original Cleveland LeBron, Miami LeBron, and second stint Cleveland LeBron. And first stint is interesting because it's LeBron at his absolute, athletic peak. And that team, I mean, he is dragging that team to be competitive every single year. He has no talent around him. They go from a 61-win team when he leaves to a 19-win team the year after. Miami, right, he's got a ton of help. That's probably defensive peak LeBron. He's shooting the cover off of the basketball, but his role looks a lot different, right? And then I prefer 2016 to 2018 because I think that's when LeBron had the most control over the basketball game and just how he dictated every single possession offensively. He just felt like he controlled every single game he played in at a different level. And what sucks about this is he obviously doesn't have the hardware to come away with it. That I don't hold against him. I don't hold it against him whatsoever. I don't know if any team in the history of basketball could have knocked off the 2017 or the 2018 Golden State Warriors. Like, that's the greatest basketball team ever. It is the greatest basketball ever played, in my opinion. I don't know what it would have taken to beat those teams. And so I don't hold that against him. But LeBron and what he could do every single possession with the ball in his hands, if it was running pick and roll, if it was just straight up getting downhill, if it was him turning to a post touch, and it's just the most brilliant, I think, LeBron ever, and how he saw the game. And it was hard for me to put anybody above LeBron. Obviously, we know who it is, but LeBron in the regular season at this time is giving you 26 points, 8 rebounds, 8 assists on 61% true shooting with over a steal a game and nearly a block a game. In the playoffs in this span, he's giving you 31 points, 9 rebounds, and 8 assists on 62% true shooting with nearly 2 steals a game and over a block a game. Twice, he leads out a top 3 offense. In all 3 of these years, he leads out a top 5 offense. Over this time, the Cavs have a win percentage of 68% with LeBron. LeBron misses 14 games over the span. They go 1-14 without LeBron during this span. I think he's the greatest rim pressure of all time. Again, I think he's one of the best half-court players of all time, this version of LeBron. And the way he was able to control the game on both sides of the ball. And the only areas that I think work against him picking against his peak is the level of defense that he was consistently at, and athletically, he wasn't at the peak of his powers. But I take that trade-off. I take that trade-off for the absolute brilliance I think you get. And I think this is the best offensive version of LeBron ever. And that's why I want him. I guess you could argue that the Heat version of LeBron is better offensively just because he's shooting better and he's better athletically. But I just think this is the LeBron who had the most control over the game, possession to possession, and that's why I want him.
Well, I definitely think this is the best offensive LeBron. I think that this is the most surgical LeBron. You use the term control of the game. That's what he had just mastered at this stage, right? The playmaking was the best it ever was. Just the sheer bully ball, the relentless mismatch attacking, the pick and roll mastery, all that stuff is at its peak at this point. And I think 2017 and 2018 are the best offensive postseasons that LeBron ever had. But this is not the LeBron that I would choose. And the reason for that is it's clearly the weakest LeBron of any of the peak iterations that you're talking about. 2016 in the playoffs specifically being the one point at which he did get to a really high level defensively, and that's why I prefer 2016 LeBron to 2018 LeBron, because I do think he was so much better defensively in that run, whereas in 2018 he was really very average defensively, and in both 2017 and 2018 was part of some pretty catastrophic team defenses, 2 of the worst team defenses to ever make the NBA Finals. He obviously more than made up for it with his all-time great offense, but I prefer 2013 and 2014 LeBron. I just think this is the best ceiling-raising LeBron. This is the most completely dominant LeBron in all phases. This is the most versatile LeBron. This is the most efficient LeBron. And this is absolutely the best he was defensively. I mean, I don't think that that's a conversation. He's 95% of the athlete he was in the first Cleveland stint, 2009-2010, in terms of explosiveness. But I do think this is the best he was overall athletically, because he was much stronger, and that made him a better player on both sides of the ball. It made him a better post player offensively. It made him a better finisher. I mean, you look at his numbers around the rim, he's shooting like 80% inside of 3 feet in 2013, 2014, and it made him a better defensive player where you could switch him onto 5s for stretches. And he was also just a smarter defensive player. He was more locked in as a helper. I think he had a better mastery of what opposing offenses were trying to do at this stage. And then this is the best off-ball LeBron ever as a cutter. This is a time at which he was thriving in transition, right? The Heat loved to play with pace, and he was dominant there. One of the best transition forces we've ever seen. This was the best he ever was as a three-point shooter before the renaissance that he had last year. But he was over 39% from deep across these 2 seasons, both regular season and playoffs. So like it was very consistent, the 3-point shooting from him in a way that it wasn't before this, and it wasn't often after this. So that's another part of the reason that this was his off-ball peak, and this was his career best efficiency. He was 64.5% true shooting in the regular season over these 2 years, and over 62% in the playoffs. So yeah, you have a better offensive version of LeBron after this, and I think before this, you have a better offensive floor-raising version. I think 2009-2010 LeBron is probably the best floor raiser we've ever seen in the regular season, taking those teams to win 66 and 61 games. You look at those rosters. Some people downplay the rosters to just fuel LeBron agendas. Like, let's not disrespect the fellas, but it was a pretty average roster that he had playing elite basketball. But I do think that there was a different level of savvy with this version of LeBron. There was a different level of versatility. And again, just being the most well-rounded LeBron who could dominate in so many roles, so many different phases. That's what he epitomizes at this point. And that's ultimately what I value most. This is the LeBron who I feel like I could most easily plug into any team with pretty good talent, which I think is what you need if you're trying to win the title. And he's just going to elevate the team in all its facets. And he's going to take us from good to absolutely great. And I think that's what he did at this stage in his career. So we picked two different versions of LeBron. I can see the case for both. I'm going with late Heat LeBron 2013 and 2014. But number one, Logan, who do you got?
Just to confirm, though, so you do have LeBron too?
I have LeBron too, yeah.
I've got Michael Jordan number one.
What?
Yeah, shocker, man.
You don't have Bobby Pettit? You don't have Robert E. Lee Pettit?
I don't have George Mikan on my list either. I'm sorry, guys.
Oh, my God. You got no idea what Slater Martin was doing back in the 50s.
Dude,
Jeez Louise.
Dude, your transatlantic accent's pretty good, brother.
No, my transatlantic accent would be a little more like this. Honey, I think you left the turkey in the oven for too long. Jimmy Stewart's coming for Thanksgiving dinner.
Can you say, honey,
he disappeared. Honey, I shrunk the kids. They're all small now, and they crawled into the neighbor's ass. Anyways, MJ?
I got Jordan specifically.
That happened in the movie. That happened in the movie.
To 93. Is that the same time period you went with?
91 to 93. I think you can definitely argue it's all the way from 89 to 93, but I think he made some improvements in 91 that I'll get into in my spiel.
I think that Michael Jordan is the greatest scorer of all time. I think he is the greatest inside the arc scorer of all time. Like, you just get the ball to MJ at the elbow inside the arc. He's going to make it happen. He had everything, man. The post game, the finishing at the rim. Like, MJ's just on a different planet as a scorer to me than LeBron, and I really value that. And I think there's this misconception, right, about that Jordan wasn't a playmaker, and a lot of people point to that as to why LeBron is better. And I want to be clear about something. I think LeBron is better at enhancing the talent around him, amplifying their abilities. I think there are some other guys, right, like Jokic, I think is probably better at amplifying players around him, just because of his ability to collapse a defense, to get to the rim, and they're just different levels of passers. But Michael Jordan was a good passer and a good playmaker. He just happens to be the greatest scorer of all time. Over this run in the regular season, MJ is giving you 31, 6, and 6 on 58% true shooting with 2.5 steals per game and nearly a block a night. And in the playoffs, he ups his scoring to 34 a night, 6 boards, 7 assists on 57% true shooting. Over this time period, the Bulls win 77% of their games with MJ. He misses 6 games over this time period. They go 1-5 in those games. And he's so clearly the best player in the regular season, but he's also so clearly the best player in all of these playoffs and in the finals. I mean, this is all-time stuff that he's doing in the finals. We talk about Shaq in his 3-year run, Hakeem in his 2 years. This is just utter dominance on the biggest stage. In 91, the Lakers are a little bit shorthanded, admittedly, but he goes 31, 7, and 11. On 56% from the field, 50% from deep, small sample size, 85% from the line. 92, he gives you 36 points a night, 5 boards and 7 assists on 53, 43, 89 splits. And in the 93 finals, he gives you 41 a night with 9 rebounds and 6 assists on 51, 40, 69 splits. Nobody had an answer for him. And the reason that I go with MJ over LeBron, I prefer that dominance and unstoppability scoring the basketball. I want that. I want the best scorer on the planet. And I think MJ's the greatest scorer ever. I think he's the greatest inside the arc scorer. I want that, and I value that more in the playoffs than I do anything that LeBron can give me. I want that takeover scoring ability, and MJ's the GOAT.
Yeah,
that's why he's number one to me.
He's not just the best scorer ever. I mean, it's really not debatable, and I feel like some people don't even have a full grasp on how truly insane the numbers are. You read off a lot of them. I'll give you the numbers all the way from 89 to 93 because I do think you can argue the peak starts in 89. Regular season, 32, 7, and 6 on plus 6% relative true shooting. Playoffs, 34.5, 7-7 on plus 4.5% relative true shooting. I mean, to have that volume, 32, almost 35 points per game in the playoffs for 5 years with 3 title runs and 2 more deep Eastern Conference Finals runs in there, to have that volume, we've never seen it, and to have that efficiency along with it, it's unfathomable, like it actually is. And the reason I say you can argue his peak starts in 89 is, even though he wins MVP in 88, 89 is when he takes an initial leap as a playmaker and as a jump shooter as well, and he's got that peak athleticism, the most athletic guard we've ever seen relative to his peers, and that peak defense, all defense caliber, arguably. Well, he wins Defensive Player of the Year in 1988, but I don't think he was ever a Defensive Player of the Year caliber defender, but he was a really, really good defender. But then, starting with 1991, I think you get another leap in terms of basketball IQ, in terms of the ability to play off ball, to fit into a system. You start getting those crazy low turnover numbers from MJ, which I think are underrated, right? The fact this dude is giving you 30 plus points per game year after year, and he's giving you 2.5 turnovers a game. You haven't seen that from anybody else in NBA history. And you have a stronger Michael Jordan, who is still an absolute freak athlete, right? Similar to the trade-off that LeBron made, where you're 95% as explosive, but you're significantly stronger. I think that's a worthwhile trade-off when you get to these more physical playoff environments. It helps you as a finisher. And obviously, famously, it helped MJ get through the bad boy Pistons. Now, I do think there's some misconceptions about the 89 and 90 series against Detroit, because MJ was actually still really great in those series. He gave you 31, 6.5, and 6.5 on plus 3% relative true shooting. It was an all-time great defense. It was just a better team. Like, I think MJ got better in 91, but he was great against the Pistons. It's just Craig Hodges was the Bulls' second leading scorer in 89. And then all of his teammates in 1990 shot 38% overall, and they shot under 24% in Game 7 of that series when MJ was still incredible. But I do think he got even better in 91. And at that point, you had the best rim finishing guard of all time. You called LeBron the best rim pressurer ever. I don't fully agree with that. I mean, I think he's top tier, but I think if we're including bigs, then it's Shaq, no doubt. But even if we're talking about guys who initiate more from the perimeter, I think Giannis.
When I said that, I guess I just meant maybe he's the greatest at weaponizing it. Like,
including playmaking?
I guess I included playmaking when I was saying that.
If you're talking downhill force, maybe is the term I would use. Yeah, okay. Well, that's fair. But I think in terms of a downhill guard, rim finishing guard, MJ is the best we've ever seen. He was the best athlete in the sport. He was an extremely efficient off-ball weapon who at this point had added an excellent mid-range game on top of that unrivaled downhill pressure from guards. And just unequivocally the best scorer of all time, who only got better in the playoffs. The volume, the efficiency only got crazier on the biggest stage. It's just a totally untouchable resume as a scorer. And he was such a good playmaker at this point. And I really think that that gets underrated with Michael Jordan. The 1991 finals was a masterful display of playmaking, and he was capable of that. I mean, it was just a question of what did the team need from him? Did they need him to be more of that on-ball pick-and-roll decision-maker facilitator, or did they need him to be an assassin scorer? Did they need him to play away from the ball more? At this point in his career, he was capable of doing all of that at an extraordinarily high level, and he was a strong plus defender. He was an elite defensive playmaker, one of the best defensive playmaking guards we've ever seen in terms of generating steals and blocks. He really was the GOAT. Put Alvin Robertson in that conversation, but he was the best shot blocking guard ever, and he was a steals machine, and he was an awesome rebounding guard as well. And so the impact on team success here, I mean, the Bulls were just unstoppable, and they were unstoppable above all else because Michael Jordan was by so far the best player on the planet. He leads number one offenses in 91 and 92, and he leads a number two offense in 1993. So I look at this version of Michael Jordan, I think that's the most perfect basketball player there ever was. I mean, I don't think 1991 is really touchable as a season. I said earlier, 67 Wilt, you could argue had the best season ever, and you could argue it, but 91 Jordan to me is clearly the best basketball player to ever exist. In the surrounding years, you go 2 years before that, you go 2 years after that, we've just never seen a basketball player like that. And I do think this was the greatest ceiling raiser we ever saw on a basketball floor. And you picked the version of LeBron that I think as an offensive floor raiser was greater than MJ because of how he could make every decision for an offense as a super ball dominant player. But as we've talked about before, I think ceiling raising is more valuable because the goal is to win a title. And to win a title, you have to scale alongside other good players. So how do you fit with them? How many different ways can you impact the game, both on and off ball? And that's where I just think this version of MJ takes the cake. And with the version of LeBron I'm comparing him to, the Heat LeBron 2013 and 2014, that version of LeBron was a better defensive player. But I think LeBron is very clearly the inferior offensive player. I just think this version of MJ, again, I mean, when you're talking about 35 a night on insane efficiency leading to the number one offense, doing it on and off ball like this, I just don't think you can touch that with the playmaking too.
How impressive do you think it was that he was putting up these scoring numbers in this era?
I mean, very impressive. I also think sometimes people sort of can conflate the late 80s, early 90s with the later 90s, and I think it's important to note that offenses were thriving in the mid-late 80s, and it's only in the mid-late 90s when they start really struggling more. And then once you get to the early 2000s, I mean, late 90s, early 2000s was the low point for offense. But nevertheless, I remember doing like some sort of equation, probably some super advanced mathematic equation that you guys can't even wrap your head around. And basically, if you account for today's offensive production, if you adjust MJ's numbers to today's offensive production, he averaged like 38 a game in the finals across his career. But I think there's more of a difference in the later years, 96 to 98, when the pace really had started to slow down and offense was a little bit harder to come by. But nevertheless, it is the greatest scoring stretch we've ever seen, and it's really not close. And I do think this version of MJ is, to me, the second best offensive player ever after only Jokic. You know, I think it's really close between a few of the guys who we mentioned, but I just think it was such an incredible scoring value you were getting from a dude who was a really good playmaker and, again, who could really do it all by the standards of this time at such a ridiculously high level. I don't want to hear anybody mention MJ's three-point shooting, bro. That didn't matter. It wasn't a thing that was expected of you in 1990. Teams took 10 threes a game. Like, that's not a thing. Don't do that. Don't do any bad faith arguments. Because I think LeBron is the GOAT. We just had this conversation.
I was just about to say, I have also come around to the fact I just think LeBron's longevity supersedes everything.
I agree.
But MJ's peak is higher, and I'll stand by that too. I mean, unparalleled dominance.
Real quick, I agree with that fundamentally. I mean, the fact that we can really debate these two peaks, right? And that I think that there's like a 2% difference between the respective peaks, but then the difference in longevity is like 75%. I mean, it's just a huge longevity difference. And even though I have somebody who said, I value ceiling raising more than floor raising, I value peak more than longevity, and MJ checks those two boxes for me more than LeBron does, longevity matters, right? Longevity is obviously part of those all-time ranking conversations. Not today, baby. Today we're just talking peak, but it's just too much. It's too much to deny. The raw impact that LeBron has had over more than 20 years of playing at such a high level is something we've never seen. And to me, that's why he's had the greatest career, and he is overall the greatest basketball player ever.
Yeah, and I think that's when, if you were doing like a league-wide redraft with like every great player, and they were starting, say, from their rookie version, so you know you're going to get 16 years or, whatever of Mike, and his peak is going to be X. That's why I would hear an argument, but it's like I can get 23 years potentially of LeBron just being one of the 5 best players on the planet for 20 of them and the best player on the planet for probably 15.
Yeah.
I'm taking that guy, and that's why he's the GOAT to me.
Yeah, and it's really only 11 healthy seasons you get from MJ in Chicago. I mean, 86 he misses most of the year, and then 95 you get him back late in the year, and he's a little rusty.
And maybe you think that,
although he did play well in the playoffs.
He did. I think that kind of gets lost.
Yeah.
And maybe you think that MJ's peak overrides that. I just disagree. But
it's hard to argue at this point, in my opinion. As somebody who argued it for a while, at this point, it's hard to argue. It's just, I think it is so overwhelming, the totality of what LeBron has done. But enough about that. Shall we move on to some honorable mentions?
The toughest cut for me was Jokic and what he's doing right now. And just in terms of modern basketball and everything you could ask for from an offensive engine, he's got it. The size, the strength, the unstoppability, right? You see in the playoffs, they got to send two guys at Jokic almost every possession when he's eating, and there's not a good answer for Jokic. He is an unsolvable problem. Jokic was my toughest cut. We mentioned him earlier. The toughest cut for me outside of him was Oscar Robertson and what he was doing. I just think, when you're looking at the early basketball, right, with like Wilt and Bill and those guys, Oscar's doing historic stuff. From 64 to 66, he gives you two number one offenses, and all of them were top three in offensive rating. He was so methodical and so smart. He would just work to get to his spots. He was an elite jump shooter. He's an all-time passer. And I don't think Oscar Robertson's supporting cast were that great, and that's what makes it hard to figure out where he ranks. Because I would hear an argument for top 10. He didn't really have great teams around him in Cincinnati when he was in Rochester, when he was at his absolute apex, right? And that's what made Oscar really hard to rank. And then after Oscar, it was Steph. And those were my top three hardest guys to leave off. For Oscar, I guess the fact that he just didn't get it done at his apex, and that there are other guys from his era that you can argue as being better players at his apex works against him. And then Steph, it's a two-way value. I think he would be by far the weakest defensive player on my board. Those were the three toughest cuts to me, though.
I love the Oscar shout. I mean, I think that Oscar is incredible. He didn't have great teams in terms of team success, but that's because their defenses really struggled. And as a floor raiser, he's one of the best we've seen, especially offensively. He's in the top tier. The Royals, in his time there, won 54% of their games with him, 24% without. He joined the worst team in the league. He immediately turned them into the number one offense. And, I said earlier, there's two runs of dudes just generating number one offenses year after year that stand above the rest. And Nash and Magic. No. There's two runs post-merger. I should not sell short what Oscar did, where he led 5 straight number one offenses to start his career. Like, it's just absolutely incredible. He was absurdly efficient. He was a brilliant playmaker. He was a dominant scorer. He's one of the best offensive players ever, but not as impactful defensively. So, yeah, I mean, if I'm not going to have Magic on my list, I don't think there's an argument to have Oscar on my list. I think that they have actually a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses as candidates.
Steph would be your second guy off, though?
Yeah, I would have Steph. I mean, Steph is, when we talk about ceiling raising offensively, if you put great skill around Steph, as we saw, believe it or not, he actually, in 2017 and 2018, had some of the best skill ever put alongside him. There's not somebody who is more effortlessly going to elevate everybody around him, right? It doesn't have to be, I have the ball in my hands, I'm making the decision. It's every second I'm on the floor, I'm stressing the defense with my movement, with the threat of my shooting, and I'm going to let everybody else eat. And if we have a connecting playmaker like Draymond, and we have shooting like Clay and Kevin Durant, and an isolation scorer like KD alongside me, everybody is going to be at their absolute best. That's what Steph has. And then also, he obviously didn't need a KD, right? He had 2 title teams without Kevin Durant, without that sort of overwhelming talent. He is a top-tier offensive player, but again, I think Jokic has a different level of control and ability to impose himself with that unbelievable efficiency, just getting a great shot at will, having a completely unstoppable A++ outcome like he does out of the post. I prefer that to Steph, especially 2016 Steph, as ahead of the time as he was. He was slighter. He could be more bothered by physical defense. He was banged up in 2016, but he didn't play up to his standards in that playoff run. And defensively, I mean, he could just really be hunted. I absolutely think that he was a weaker defender at this time in his career than Jokic, who I think, again, makes a positive impact in much more different categories. So those were easily my 2 toughest. I like Oscar. He'd be on my short list. The third dude who I had was Kevin Garnett, because I think so highly of KG. Well, actually, I think Giannis, too. I think both of these guys would be a couple of my first 2 off. Ultimately, it comes down to offensive limitations with both of them as a number one in a playoff setting. I think Giannis, we had this whole debate on Mars's show for a while, But I think Giannis is a little more capable of that in the playoffs, and we saw that in 2021, and we saw that in 2022 just because of how he imposes himself on the game physically. KG's obviously a better defensive player, but I slightly prefer that offensive edge that goes in Giannis's favor. But KG is one of the most impactful players ever, especially in the regular season. Like the on-off stuff that Jokic is doing. Well, KG did it first. He had back-to-back years with a plus 20 on-off at least. One of the most versatile defenders ever, one of the smartest defenders ever, and a hugely impactful offensive player with his versatility, his playmaking. It's just in the playoffs, 2000 to 2004, you look at that range, he gives you 23 points, 5 assists a game on below league average true shooting. He's doing it in tough circumstances, but he just didn't have that ability to will himself to quality offense that even a Tim Duncan does. Because obviously I'm not holding KG to the offensive standard of these other guys because he's such a special defensive player. The offense is just second. But what you can do as an offensive number one really matters to me in these all-time great conversations, and I just think KG's more limited there. Obviously, Russell is the exception to this because of everything we talked about, but that was just a different time for defense, and he was a different kind of defensive force than anyone else.
I think KG would be my fifth guy off. I think my fourth guy off would be Dr. J. And
I like Dr. J as a shout.
The reason that I don't think Dr. J could be on this list is just because I think his prime was in the ABA, and so you just don't ever get to see him like – I mean, don't get me wrong. He comes into Philadelphia, but I think his absolute apex is in the ABA when he is MVP every year. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure from 74 to 76 they come away with 2 finals, and – I think he's got really rare two-way impact from a guy on the wing when you're talking about what he could do defensive playmaking-wise, on the perimeter, on the interior. They're one of the league's best defenses all 3 years, and I don't think he has those scoring limitations when it comes to the playoffs. And I think he's an underrated playmaker, too. I just don't think Dr. J had a hole in his game, and he'd be, I think, my 4th toughest cut. I think Dr. J was the total package.
Great shout. I'm going to shout out one more dude, and then we can move on because there's so many great players. But I actually would have this dude slightly above KG because we did have this whole debate on Mars. I would go Giannis, then I would go KD, then I would go KG. I just think KD's peak was so monumentally high, and to me that is in the Golden State years, even though he wasn't quite the same athlete he was in Oklahoma City, wasn't quite the same rim pressurer, just the improvement defensively. His ability to thrive in that role is more of a rim protector, and I do think he was a little bit better as a playmaker, and offensively he was in a phenomenal situation to thrive, but just, to me, the second best scorer we've ever seen after MJ, and I think you would say the most complete scorer we've ever seen. Part of that is just the nature of the game and the value of the three-point shot today, but the efficiency, the effortlessness with which he could kill you from all 3 levels, and the ability to thrive offensively in so many different situations and also have a positive impact defensively. KD, obviously, doesn't have that one run that stands out where he willed a team to the title, because although he's amazing in the finals and in the playoffs in 2017 and 2018, and he was amazing in the playoffs in 2019 before he got hurt, he was out of his mind. All of that is clouded by the fact that
he's a cheater.
He's playing on the most talented team ever, and like Steph led those teams to be 27-4 over those years in games that Kevin Durant didn't play in the regular season. But nevertheless, I mean, I think the ability is undeniable. And do I think he could have led a team to win the title, a less talented team? Absolutely. At his peak, he was certainly playing at that level. So I give him the slight edge over KG just because I think the offensive gap is obviously very big there, and that's what I'm going to lean on when it comes to one of those tiebreaker situations. I mean, we could shout out dudes all day. We could shout out Jerry West. We could shout out Kobe. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, we could.
But again, if you want more of our thoughts on just some of these modern guys, go check out the episode that we did with Mars. That was a lot of fun. But today we covered all the bases, Logan. We covered all the ground, all the way from the Bill Russell days to the Nikola Jokic days that we have right now. And by the way, just for full transparency, we're recording this Monday. It's going to go up Friday. So if Nikola Jokic falls off in the next 3 days, then RIP to his peak.
LeBron recently fell off, so you never know.
I'm seeing everybody freak out about whatever game he's having right now. I got to go watch that and rewatch that. And maybe we'll talk about that tomorrow, which for you guys will actually be in the past. But hope you enjoy this one. This was a ton of fun. Really love diving into historical stuff like this, and hope that you guys enjoyed as well. If you want more of our content, well, there's plenty more of it. Check out the Nerd Sesh YouTube channel. This is where we have all our full shows, NBA and NFL. And we also have our video essays, our video breakdowns, where we go more in depth on one specific topic. You can also listen to the show across all audio platforms, and you can follow us across social, TikTok and Instagram at NerdSesh, Twitter at Nerd_Sesh. You can see all of the clips from the show there, graphics from the show. When we do a ranking like this, we love getting a graphic out there and making everybody angry. And you can also see all of our trivia content. Our short form trivia content, which we also love. You can also check out our merch. The link to that is at the link tree across our social media bios. That is at breakingt.com as well. And you can join our Discord if you want to chat with the gang. Always a nice community to be a part of, I like to think at the very least, and just talk some sports. So with that, as always, appreciate you guys. I've been Carson Brabber.
I have been Logan Camden.
And this was Nerd Sesh.